Is our video lecture over interest groups. And so I've got this one grouped together with political parties because, in a lot of ways, interest groups and political parties are very similar. So, first, we'll just define what an interest group is: a formal organization of individuals seeking to influence government to promote their common cause. So if we look at that definition, interest groups aren't terribly different than the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. The biggest difference being is that interest groups tend to focus on a singular issue or set of circumstances that affect members of the group. So this can be everything from an identity, like the NAACP, or LULAC, that represent the African American community and the Latino community. It can be something like PETA, for people for the ethical treatment of animals, or representing particular industries like the oil and gas industry or the medical industry, things like that. So interest groups are a little more focused on a very specific purpose, and so, but interest groups can be made up of politicians, they can be made up of citizens, activists, and anyone can be involved, provided they are motivated enough to get involved with a group. And these groups do a lot of the same things that political parties do to exert influence over government, such as funding campaigns, giving donations, lobbying, which we'll talk about in a bit. And there's, it's a dual-edged sword where theoretically, this is a good thing. It gives people an ability to come together around an issue that they really are passionate about. But again, it does open that door to lots of outside interest trying to influence our elected officials, that can supersede the will of the people given enough money. So, looking at, we've mentioned James Madison quite a bit this semester, but in Federalist Paper number 10, James Madison referred to what would become the idea of interest groups and political parties as factions. And he talked about the mischief of factions and believed that, these competing interests that were ideological could it could pull citizens apart from each other. And, the one thing at the beginning, James Madison and Washington and many of the founding fathers believed is that, we should think of ourselves as a country first and try and remain united. But James Madison also believed in what we call the pluralist theory. The pluralist theory, Madison said that there would be so many groups competing for the attention and resources of government that no one group would be able to become too powerful. Back in Madison's day, that was probably true, but I don't think he could have anticipated the way money would come to influence politics and dominate politics the way it does today. So most definitely, groups with lots of money and supporters and resources, they stand a better chance of having the federal government and state governments take up their cause. And so, that kind of, it's not to say that pluralist theory isn't true, it just may not be as effective as James Madison thought it was. Now, looking at some types of interest groups that exist. The most successful groups are economic or corporate groups, and these exist at all levels of business and represent entire industries, can represent small businesses, big businesses, whatever. But what these groups are trying to do is to get Congress to pass legislation that helps them turn as much of a profit as possible. So obviously they want things like low regulations on their industry, tax breaks, credits, things like that. Probably the most well-known business interest group is the Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber of Commerce spends more money on lobbying than probably any other group, and most people aren't aware of what they actually are. the Chamber of Commerce is an interest group that represents the interest of small business. And so, small business issues are very different than those of large corporations. But your average small business, you think about a barber shop, a restaurant, or something like that, they don't have the type of money that, say, Apple or Amazon or someone like that has. So instead, small businesses formed the chamber so they could pool their resources and lobby Congress for things that are relevant to small businesses. Um, but our business groups tend to be more successful because they have a large amount of resources, especially our big corporations. Labor groups or labor unions, unfortunately, they're not quite as powerful as they used to be in our country. But labor unions really started to pick up steam in the United States in the early 20th century. And the idea was labor groups would bring workers together so that they could use their collective voice to bargain for things like better wages, better working hours, better benefits. And so, you see still today, in some industries, labor unions still are pretty strong, like manufacturing, aviation, oil field work. But, if you're one employee and you're dissatisfied with your job and you decide to just stop doing your job, you're going to get fired. But if everyone in an entire industry decides to go on strike and stop doing their job, then the corporations are forced to negotiate because they can't replace everyone. So that's what labor unions do, is they try and force big corporations or industries and things to negotiate with the worker. Professional associations can be similar to economic groups. It just depends on who they're representing. But professional associations tend to represent jobs in a couple of different ways. Trade associations are usually it's a skill that is passed down. You go through training, but it may be informal training just between two individuals, things like locksmiths or becoming a welder or farmers. A lot of those things are kind of passed down through families. But trade groups represent these fields and can make, businesses come to the table to negotiate with them, or they can push for legislation favorable to their industry. Professional associations represent, fields where you have to have typically a degree and a license. So doctors, dentists, lawyers, nurses, teachers, these types of things. Excuse me. But they all exist for the same reason, and that is for the benefit of people working in that trade or that profession. And then our citizen groups can be broken down in a couple of different ways. There's identity groups, which we talked about. Identity groups can be everything from the NAACP to the Human Rights Coalition. The Ku Klux Klan would fall in this category. And National Organization of Women. A lot of these groups represent someone because of an identity that they were born into. It's something that you really can't change about yourself. And a lot of these groups have been on the forefront of, pushing cases into the Supreme Court, providing legal support for people of these identity groups to push for greater rights. Like the NAACP, like we said, has been a party to some of the biggest Supreme Court decisions in our history. Public interest groups are groups that are advocating for issues that benefit us all. This could be like the environment, preservation of resources, public safety. Some examples: Greenpeace, the Sierra Club. Environmental groups are probably the ones that people are most familiar with. The problem with public interest groups is that if they're successful, we all reap the benefits of their success, whether we put in any money or time or anything to advocate for their cause. So them being successful, it's hard to get people enrolled to the cause because we'll reap the benefits whether we get involved or not. And then our single issue groups are very focused on one specific issue, whereas would say, the NAACP. It may be an African American advocacy group, but there's all different areas of the law that they deal with. Same with public interest groups. But single issue groups, this would be like the NRA. Their single focus is the Second Amendment and protecting gun rights. PETA is advocating for the ethical treatment of animals and veganism. Texans for Education Reform, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. All of these groups are very laser focused on one specific issue and will, support or endorse candidates based on their stance on their particular issue. And usually they are very ideological leaning. So, like your NRA, conservative, PETA, very liberal. If you took a group like, pro life and pro choice groups, they would have heavy ideological leanings. So, groups to be successful have to have a good organization structure. A lot of that has moved online. So, whereas we had grassroots previously, where people would come together at the smallest level and build an organization from the ground up, today some of that is called net roots because a lot of this work is done online. So, you can look at Facebook and Twitter and places like that, and they've been used to organize political movements, bring people together. Probably one of the most relevant recent examples is Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter started out, as a localized effort in like Baltimore, and then in outside St. Louis, Missouri, and then kind of just expanded into this nationwide movement. And a lot of that was due to the internet and, groups posting things about, mistreatment of African Americans by law enforcement. And it kind of grew into this whole movement online. And so social media has become a really important tool in bringing people together. Membership groups, again, tend to be a little more successful because you pay a fee to be part of that group, but in return, you're getting some type of benefit as well. But all of that money goes into the effort and work of the group. So a good example here is the NRA. To be a member of the NRA, you pay membership dues. But in exchange for these membership fees that you pay, you get things like discounts on guns at certain retailers. You get discounts on, say, your gun range fees. A previous student who was a member told me that if your gun is ever stolen from you and used to commit a crime, the NRA, if you're a member, will actually provide you legal defense, to protect yourself. So there's a lot of benefits that come for gun owners for being a member of that organization. But they pay for those benefits, which is different than, say, a public interest group. Staff organization, member associations are typically run by people who believe in the cause and are dues-paying members and things like that. Different types of groups may be run differently. Like the NAACP, it's a highly educated group of individuals usually with legal education and things like that. But the organization of a group can determine, how it's run, which policy issues they decide to take up, and who's in charge in directing the actions of that group. But having good organization is vital to a group being successful. The free rider problem is what we talked about with our public interest groups, that, these people are very committed to things like the environment, clean air, clean water, saving the animals, stuff like that. And if, like we said, if they're successful, that benefits all of us. We all need clean air. We all need clean water. But yet none of us have to actively get involved. And if they're successful, we reap the benefits. And that's called the free rider problem. And that's why your business associations and membership groups tend to be more successful than, say, environmental groups, is because they have the resources to back up their cause. And then collective goods are what public interest groups are fighting for. These are things that we all use and all tend to benefit from, like we've said, the environment, public health, green spaces, preserving, wildlife and nature, things like that. So why do people join groups? One, they want to stay informed about a particular issue. If you look at, say, AARP stands for the American Association for Retired Persons. And so once you turn 65, you get Medicare, you get Social Security benefits, and things like that. And so AARP does a really good job of keeping people in that category informed of, say, any legislation that may threaten their benefits or discounts that are available or programs that are available to seniors. So a lot of people join just to stay kind of on top of what's available to them. Material benefits are kind of what the membership groups do. They give you some type of material benefit, whether it's discounts or, if you've ever donated to NPR, maybe you get like a mug or a tote bag or something like that. And it's not the reason you get involved, but it's them giving you something back for your money. Solidarity benefits and purposive benefits, these are the ones that your truly driven individuals join for. They feel a calling or a purpose to this particular issue, and they tend to want to socialize and network with people who are involved in that particular issue. And this is, labor unions, professional associations, a lot of them are driven by this, but also your identity groups, your public interest groups. People just have this calling to want to do something they perceive as good. Now, the best interest group, or the most successful interest groups, are good at lobbying. Lobbying is the number one tool that interest groups have at their disposal. And lobbying, at its core, is just direct communication with members of the legislative or executive branch to influence legislation or policy. So, by that definition, anyone can be a lobbyist, just not all of us get paid for it. If you have ever emailed your congressperson, if you have ever protested, if you have ever, written, called, done anything like that for an elected official, you have become a lobbyist because you're trying to influence them to vote a certain way. The problem with lobbying, most people have this negative connotation with lobbying, and that's because money gets involved, and that's where lobbying kind of gets a bad reputation, and rightly so. A lot of big interest groups, especially your professional associations, your business interest, they employ full-time lobbyists who are very well-paid individuals making 6 figures to 7, 8 figures to do this job. Now, what do? They can give campaign contributions to the people they are trying to lobby. So that's one big thing that lobbyists do on behalf of their organizations. Favors. This, if, say, I find out, that a bunch of the senators or House reps are really into baseball, and so I get a box at the ballpark, and I invite all of them there, and of course, like, my firm is going to pay for all the food and the drinks. You just come, and then while they're there, you talk to them about your issue. Or you find out that a particular senator whose vote you're trying to get is really into, Broadway. So you buy in tickets and send them over and things like that. Those are favors. Most of us would consider that bribery, but this falls into a different category. Now, there are limits about how much can be spent. The money has to be tracked and registered and things like that. But it's widely perceived as okay, legally. Number 3, bribes. So what's considered a bribe for a lobbyist? That is a lobbyist giving a elected official cash directly. They cannot do that. But most people with common sense don't see much difference between number 2 and number 3. Number 4, information exchange. A lot of the information that our elected officials rely on when they are making their decisions will come from different interest groups. So they're being bombarded by this information. Many of these individuals may be called to testify before Congress because they're experts in their particular field. So they are trying to get their point of view across with the information they disseminate. Public advocacy. This is more your public groups, getting people involved, trying to shape the narrative of an issue and things like that. And then quid pro quo. You do this for me, we do this for you. And that kind of goes along with number two as well. You vote this particular way, and then maybe we can arrange campaign contributions or support for your upcoming election or whatever it is. So when money gets involved, that's when things, tend to make people uncomfortable, because the more money involved in our political system, it takes power away from the people. Now, what do interest groups, what's their strategy, what are they trying to do? Well, first and foremost, they're trying to shape legislation. They want to convince our elected officials to pass legislation favorable to their cause or their industry or whatever it is. Like I said, they may testify at hearings as they are experts in this particular issue. So, the Democrats will probably call some of their experts, the Republicans will call some of their experts, and obviously they're going to contradict each other. Educate members, like we said, they disseminate a lot of information trying to get our elected officials to see things from their point of view. Comment on the rules. So if someone is putting, say, harsher emission standards in place, they are going to want to speak vocally about that to Congress, present evidence on why that is not a good idea. Maybe it'll hurt business. Maybe it'll do this. Build coalitions, building coalitions among the elected officials that support your issue, and partnering up with other groups working on similar causes. And then monitor programs. If Congress passes a law and it goes into effect, you can guarantee that interest groups in that particular issue are going to watch it and track it and have data about it. And if, one side sees that it's not working, they're going to present that information to Congress and say, look, you need to change this. What y'all did is not working. We told you it wasn't going to work. So they're watchdogs of anything that regulates their cause. These two graphs just kind of illustrate a couple of interest group concepts. First is the iron triangle. The iron triangle kind of shows the relationship between interest groups, Congress, and the bureaucracy. So our interest groups, if you look at the red lines here, they provide electoral support to Congress. So they're giving to campaigns, campaign donations, maybe expertise and advice. Those people get elected to Congress. They in turn give their funding and political support to the agencies in government that have to do with that interest group's issue. And then, they pass laws and then direct the bureaucracy on how to carry out those laws. So through the bureaucracy, the interest group is going to get things like low regulation, special favors, all that kind of stuff that this is basically, why you would contribute to a congressperson. It's an investment hoping you get beneficial legislation and things like that back in the future. That's why they do it. Now, an issue network just takes this concept and expands it to a particular issue. So in this graph, our issue is healthcare. And so who are all of the interest groups who would be interested in that issue? And that makes up an issue network. So we have the American Medical Association. This organization represents the best interest of doctors. The FDA regulates drugs. The Congress, the Social Security Administration. Pfizer is a drug manufacturer. National Organization of Women. Women's healthcare issues, things like abortion and stuff like that, are different and, oftentimes are targeted when healthcare is being debated. The presidents and the president's administration. Cigna, which is an insurance company. So all of these interests make up an issue network, people who are going to have a stake in the issue that's being debated. And then some other strategies of interest groups. Grassroots mobilization tend to make groups more I guess you would say legitimate in the eyes of citizens. Grassroots, like we said, just means that everything kind of starts at the community level. And so you have just average, everyday Americans coming together to get involved in the issues they care about. And they use that, building those coalitions to pressure elected officials about issues. Lobbyists can be used if a group has the resources, but the group itself may be acting as their own lobbyist. But you can see, grassroots organizations like Black Lives Matter and stuff like that. They pretty much form because of kind of the circumstances of law enforcement and the African American community. And this was an issue, that really resonated with the African American community all over the country, and it built into this large uh, coalition of people who united under this banner of Black Lives Matter. And so they turn out to protest. They, try and connect with Congress people who want reform in law enforcement and things like that. But it just started with a few people and grew into this nationwide movement. Protest and radical activism. So that's what I've got over here, these photos. The top two are examples of PETA. PETA does some of the best kind of radical activism. This is one where they had humans wrapped up like meat and covered in blood. They do a lot of nude protest, protest the use of fur and things like that. And then down here, this is Greenpeace. Greenpeace is a kind of radical environmentalist group, and they're using their tiny little boat here to try and, bring up issues like whether it's oil drilling, offshore oil drilling, or whether it's whaling or things like that. They just bring attention to it. So the more kind of radical and outside the box your movement can get, it brings more attention to it. It tends to make the news, and so more people see, see what you're doing out there. But of course, it can go too far, and that's examples like property damage, sabotage, bombings, hacking, things like that. But those have become, especially hacking crusades, online have become more and more popular to go after individuals, to find dirt that they don't want exposed and things like that. We talked about political action committees, so I won't go into those too much more, but usually most of your interest groups will have an associated political action committee, and they collect money through that action committee to give that money to people who are running for office who shared their view of their issue. Interest groups are going to endorse candidates that align with their ideas. Many of them will organize, get out the votes campaigns, provide transportation on election days, and then like something that like the NRA has done is they came up with their own rating system. They give politicians a score of A through F based on how Second Amendment friendly they perceive them to be. So obviously, in 2016, Donald Trump gets an A, Hillary Clinton gets an F, and those are just shortcuts to tell their supporters who they should back if that issue is the most important thing to them. And then ballot initiatives. Sometimes we see groups come together, especially at the local level, to get things put on their local ballot for the public to vote on. One that has been kind of happening in a lot of places are smoking bans. You have a lot of these groups that have come together and get some kind of like funding and grants from bigger groups like, say, the American Cancer Society and stuff like that to, petition, get ballot initiatives put on to ban smoking, say in bars and stuff like that. And they've been very successful at the local level in doing this. We've seen this around trans bathroom issues here in Texas and nationwide. Property tax breaks, that's another one that's got a lot of mobilization in Texas, but starting at the local level too, and that can kind of gain an issue more attention as it moves up to the state and federal level as well.